An ancient desert ruin harboring the ghosts of its former inhabitants. A sprawling hotel whose halls are roamed by the apparitions of past guests and staff that just couldn't check out. And an iconic saloon where the spirit of the West never really dies. Are you sure you're ready to explore some of the most haunted places in Arizona? Our first haunt takes us to the center of Arizona and on an expedition through the ruined city of Besh-Ba-Gowah. Kicking off this adventure, Besh-Ba-Gowah, which is placed in Gila County in Arizona, is a massive 200-room prehistoric Salado pueblo that, today, is a popular stop for tourists, history buffs, and nature enthusiasts, and its sweeping bounds are also shrouded in some of the state's oldest and eeriest ghost stories. Historically, predating the early 13th century, lands now holding Besh were occupied, or at the very least frequented by the Hohokam at times, who actually constructed a pit house village on site, and later, around 1225 CE, the Salado established a permanent settlement atop this village. From the time of its formation up through the mid-1400s, Besh-Ba-Gowah would evolve into a major Salado mecca and would boast multi-story masonry that composed countless corridors, rooms, a large central plaza, and more. At this time, the city was likely used as a keep of sorts, as well as a main trading post and fort complete with its own builders, farmers, potters, toolmakers, traders, and primitive political structure. By 1450 CE, however, Salado occupation through the region would decline drastically, and during this same period, Besh was left abandoned to stand the test of time alone out there in the desert. By the 1800s, Apache who passed the old ruin had formally established a name for it, Besh-Ba-Gowah, which, in their tongue, meant place of metal, and actually likely referred to the city of globes mining of the region. From 1883 to 1884, archaeologist Adolf Bandelier documented the ruin, and in 1892 would publish a sketch map of the site, and in 1929, members of the Gila Pueblo Museum would visit the locale and would formally record it, resulting in its later Arizona State Museum site designation. In 1935, excavation of the site was started under one Irene S. Vickery, and from 1938 to 1940, the work would be officialized as a WPA archaeological project, with plans for future excavation, stabilization, and interpretation. However, sadly, by the 1950s, Besh would fall into disrepair, and several of its rooms were even reportedly damaged by a bulldozer used to level a nearby trailer park. Things would look up in the 60s, however, and following the removal of said trailer park and appropriate advertising of the site, of course, tourist numbers would slowly increase, and allotted profits would be used in the reconstruction of various Besh structures, in new exhibits, in botanical gardens, and much, much more. In the present, Besh-Ba-Gowah remains open to the public officially from 9 through 5, though we have sort of heard that they kind of keep it open from dawn until dusk. But don't quote us on that. And it continues to accommodate tens of thousands of visitors each and every year. Chillingly, but not uncommon in the least for the era, the patios and open spaces of Besh harbor a dark little bit of history. You see, back then the dead were buried right underneath them. So unlike our modern cities, which try their damnedest to separate the cemeteries from the rest of the world, Besh-Ba-Gowah was literally a settlement built atop the dead. And culturally, it was believed the dead were present in daily life just as much as the living. That being said, visitors and officials to Besh have reported disembodied footsteps heard from empty patches of desert, instances of objects sighted moving around on their own, and extreme cold patches that are very uncharacteristic of the area's normally, well, oppressively hot climate. After dark, supernatural activity on site is said to increase tenfold, with reports of disembodied voices, chanting, or even of war cries heard through the night skies, of phantom lights sighted floating above specific areas or rooms that aren't even there anymore, and of encounters with both shadowy apparitions and something dark that whistles in the distance. Oh, and as a reminder for those of you who may not be up to date on their Native American folklore, don't, ever whistle back at something that whistles to you at night. In fact, probably just start running. Lots of running would likely be the best policy. Anyways, lastly, some tell the area around the abandoned old ruins plays host to something much more sinister than ghosts. To one of Arizona's most famous cryptids. You guessed it, to skinwalkers. Now, if you're not familiar, I'll give you the TLDR version for time's sake. Skinwalkers were powerful witches that learned to transform themselves into various animals, only their forms were often flawed. You know, missing tails, the wrong colors, half-human, half-animal hybrid features, the usual. To top things off, they relentlessly hunted and tormented humans for centuries. Only, unlike other cryptids who do the same, they didn't actually, eat the humans. So they were basically just giant dicks who could shapeshift, move super fast, disappear, and that were nearly unkillable. Now, I say nearly because there were a handful of things, including white ash-dipped weaponry, several rituals, and even knowing their true name, kind of like Rumpelstiltskin, that would knock them out of the game pretty darn quick. Oh, and if you stabbed or shot one with something silver, they seemed to stop moving and come down with a bad case of, well, death. So there's that. Regardless, several visiting Besh have reported run-ins with what they believe were skinwalkers, and these reports range from harmlessly creepy to outright threatening in nature. So if you are planning a trip to these ruins, keep your head on a swivel, or just, keep your head. Our second haunt lands us in southern Arizona, just to the north of the Mexican border, and has us buying rounds at the iconic Big Nose Kate's Saloon. Continuing this adventure, Big Nose Kate's Saloon, which is placed on historic Allen Street in Tombstone, Arizona, is a rowdy, rough-and-tumble Old West saloon and restaurant built over the remains of the former Grand Hotel, a once luxurious frontier lodging that stood right in the middle of Tombstone's blood-soaked silver boom. Today, the saloon is known for cold drinks, live music, cowboy chaos, and for its ties to Doc Holliday, the Earp brothers, the Clantons, the McLowrys, and of course, Mary Catherine Horney, or better known as Big Nose Kate. But beneath all the bar noise and wily fun, the building is also said to be intensely haunted, especially its basement, where one strange old spirit may still be guarding something he refused to leave behind in life. Historically, the saloon's past begins in 1877 when one Ed Schieffelin discovered silver in the surrounding hills. And by 1879, Tombstone had transformed from a dusty mining camp into one of the fastest growing boomtowns in Arizona. Miners, gamblers, cowboys, lawmen, brothel owners, gunfighters, and businessmen flooded its streets almost overnight. And because apparently desert heat, silver money, and loaded revolvers weren't already a bad enough combination, the town was also packed with a ridiculous number of saloons. And then right in the middle of this absolute powder keg, the Grand Hotel would open its doors on September 9th of 1880. And for this time era, it was a serious flex, boasting 16 rooms, fine carpets, walnut furnishings, oil paintings, classy chandeliers, and a kitchen that could reportedly feed hundreds of people in only a couple of hours. During its short original lifespan, the Grand Hotel became associated with several of Tombstone's biggest names, including Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, Doc Holliday, Ike Clanton, and the McLowry brothers. In fact, Ike Clanton, Tom McLowry, and Frank McLowry were reportedly registered at the hotel the night before the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, which erupted on October 26th of 1881, and that left Billy Clanton and both the McLowry brothers dead, while Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday walked away with wounds. So yeah, for a building that only lasted a couple of years in its original form, the Grand Hotel managed to get itself planted directly in the middle of Wild West history like it had a personal deadline or something. But before we get too far, we obviously have to talk about Kate herself, because despite the name above the door, Big Nose Kate did not actually originally own the Grand Hotel, and the modern saloon was simply named after her much later. In life, her real name was Mary Catherine Horney, though like many Old West legends, her name appears in records a few different ways because spelling was apparently more of a casual group project back then. Born in Hungary around 1850, Kate eventually made her way to America and across the Wild West frontier under names like Kate Elder and Kate Fisher, and by the late 1870s, she had met Doc Holliday in Fort Griffin, in Texas, launching one of the messiest, most famous on and off relationships in frontier history. By early summer of 1880, Kate and Doc had both reached Tombstone, and the rest of her life would remain tied one way or another to Doc, the Earps, the Cowboys, and the legends that made Tombstone nearly impossible to separate from myth. She would outlive almost all of them, in fact, and would eventually pass on at the Arizona Pioneers home in Prescott in 1940. As for the Grand Hotel, its glory days burned hot and then it just outright burned. As after surviving Tombstone's first major fire in 1881, it was actually destroyed later during the town's devastating fire of May 25th in 1882, with much of the structure collapsing down into the basement. Over the decades, the site was rebuilt, altered, damaged, and repurposed, until by the 1970s it had taken on its modern identity as Big Nose Kate's Saloon. Named in honor of the tough, sharp-tongued Doc Holliday adjacent legend whose life had become almost as famous as the town itself. Chillingly, the basement beneath Big Nose Kate's is where the saloon's most famous ghost story begins, with a mysterious figure known only as the Swamper. According to legend, the Swamper was once the Grand Hotel's janitor and odd job man during the late 1800s, a quiet worker who lived in a small room below the hotel, away from the drinking, gambling, arguing, and general "someone is absolutely getting pistol whipped or shot tonight" energy upstairs. But the Swamper supposedly had another hobby besides sweeping floors and keeping the place running, and that was his undying pursuit of silver. You see, beneath Tombstone ran old mine shafts and underground passages, and the Swamper is said to have secretly dug from this basement room towards one of them, eventually hitting a vein of silver and mining it little by little from right below the hotel's floor. Now, no one knows what happened to the silver he supposedly found, whether he just spent it, hid it somewhere inside the building, or packed it away like the world's dustiest underground dragon cave. But according to the saloon's own legend, the old mine entrance still exists in the basement, and the Swamper's ghost may still be guarding whatever treasures he left behind in life. Today, employees and visitors have reported seeing a ghostly figure right around the stairs, basement, and the back areas of Big Nose Kate's, with many believing it to be the Swamper. Still patrolling the same building where he once worked, slept, and apparently ran the least HR-approved mining operation in the state. Other non-Swamper related reports from inside the saloon include sudden cold spots, disembodied footsteps heard across its old floorboards, strange noises from empty rooms, objects sighted moving on their own, and shadowy movement sighted near the old tunnel area and behind the bar. Some visitors claim photos taken inside later reveal odd shapes, faces, or figures that no one remembers seeing at the time, while others have described the feeling of being watched from the stone and timber spaces below the bar, almost as though someone is standing just out of sight, making sure nobody gets a little too curious near the Swamper's old room. Our third haunt drags us deeper into the deserts of Arizona and has us braving the shadow of the legendary Superstition Mountain. Continuing this adventure, Superstition Mountain, which rises just outside of Apache Junction in Arizona, is the massive western anchor point of the larger Superstition Mountain range, a jagged wall of volcanic cliffs, desert slopes, hidden canyons, brutal trails, and sun-blasted wilderness that towers roughly 3,000 feet above the surrounding Sonoran Desert. Today, it's one of the state's most iconic natural landmarks, with the Lost Dutchman State Park sitting at its base, and the much larger Superstition Wilderness stretching far beyond it. But behind all the hikers, photographers, treasure hunters, and retirees in disturbingly expensive hiking shoes, this mountain is also wrapped in stories of lost gold, phantom lights, missing men, cursed maps, and restless spirits that still move through the rock after dark. Historically, the mountain itself is ancient, formed through violent volcanic activity roughly 17 to 29 million years ago, before further erosion slowly shaped its cliffs, spires, and deep canyons into the landmark we see and love today. Long before prospectors started wandering into the area with pickaxes, greed, and dangerously little water, the region was known to native peoples of the Salt and Gila River valleys, and many later accounts connect the name Superstition to stories early settlers heard from the Pima or Akimel Udum about the mountains being feared or avoided. By the late 1860s, those stories were being repeated by farmers in the Salt River Valley, and by 1870, Superstition Mountain was appearing on US military maps everywhere. So, in classic settler fashion, they heard local warnings, misunderstood the deeper context, and still somehow gave the place one of the best spooky names in American geography. So, that's pretty cool. Through the 1800s, the region became tangled in ranching, military activity, prospecting, and violent expansion. But the legend that made the mountain world famous was, of course, of the Lost Dutchman's Mine. Now, this story centers on Jacob Volz, a German immigrant prospector who later became known as the Dutchman, because apparently the Old West also had no issue being confidently incorrect about geography. Now, according to the most famous versions, Volz discovered or was shown an incredibly rich gold mine somewhere in the Superstitions through the 1870s, possibly through a connection to the Peralta family, whose own legendary mines were also said to be hidden somewhere within the range. Volz died in Phoenix in October of 1891, and not long afterwards, Julia Thomas and the Petrash brothers attempted to follow the clues he supposedly left behind. What they came back with was no mine, no fortune, no map, and probably an unwanted, newly formed relationship with cacti. From there, the legend spiraled. Treasure hunters poured into the Superstitions, chasing Volz's gold, the Peralta mines, Jesuit treasure, secret maps, hidden caves, and all sorts of wildly specific clues that somehow never managed to really lead anyone to anything of any value whatsoever. One of the most infamous of these cases came in 1931 when one Adolph Ruth, a Washington, D.C. veterinarian and self-professed treasure hunter, entered the mountains with a map he believed could lead him to the Peralta mines or maybe even the Lost Dutchman's treasure. Unfortunately, Adolph vanished that June, and on December 10th, his skull was found near the Three Red Hills. The rest of his remains were discovered later in January of 1932, and while official conclusions pointed toward exposure, starvation, dehydration, or simply animals scattering his remains, the mystery only fed the mountain's fearsome reputation. Because nothing says, definitely keep searching for treasure here, quite like finding the decapitated skull of the last guy who tried. By the 20th century, the Superstitions had become both a recreational landmark and a full-blown urban legend factory. The Tonto Forest Reserve was established in 1905, the Superstition Primitive Area followed in 1939, and later wilderness protections helped preserve much of the range. Lost Dutchman State Park was developed at the base of the mountain in the 1970s, giving visitors a safer way to experience the scenery and the stories without immediately wandering into a desert maze full of hazards, such as heat stroke, cliffs, rattlesnakes, and, well, poor decisions. In the present, Superstition Mountain remains a major destination for hikers, campers, artists, historians, and treasure hunters who still show up today convinced they're one clever interpretation away from solving the whole thing, which, honestly, respect the confidence but bring plenty of water. Chillingly, the most famous spirit said to haunt the Superstition Mountain is that of Jacob Volz himself, or at least something tied to the mine he supposedly refused to leave behind. And hikers and campers have reported seeing an old prospector moving through the rocks near dusk, sometimes carrying a lantern, sometimes standing on ledges where no trail appears to reach, and sometimes vanishing behind boulders far too small to hide a grown man. Others claim to hear pickaxes striking stone from somewhere inside the mountain, followed by distant footsteps, shifting gravel, or the glow of a lantern bobbing through places where no person should be standing or walking. And in some stories, the Dutchman is actually still searching for his own mine, which he lost. While in others, he knows exactly where it is and is making pretty darn sure no one else figures it out. The mountain is also famous for strange lights, especially glowing orbs and lantern-like flashes seen moving across the slopes or floating through the canyons after dark. Some appear briefly above rocky ridges before blinking out, while others drift low across the desert floor, almost like they're trying to lead people off the trails. Hikers and officials have also reported voices echoing from empty canyons, footsteps crunching behind them in gravel, and shadowy figures that appear ahead on the trail before disappearing around formations where there's nowhere to go. Several stories claim the mountain seems to confuse people on purpose, stretching its trails longer than they should be, hiding familiar landmarks behind heat shimmer, and calling out in voices that sound just human enough to warrant someone taking one very bad step in the wrong direction. And while the Lost Dutchman dominates the stories around Superstition Mountain itself, the rest of the range is also overflowing with its own legends. Around Weaver's Needle, people have reported phantom campfires, distant chanting, and lights that move between rocks like someone is carrying a torch through the impossible terrain. Near areas tied to the Peralta legends and the so-called massacre grounds, stories tell of ghostly riders, old miners, shadowy figures on ridgelines, and screams carried through the canyon winds. And other legends entirely speak of hidden caves, buried Spanish treasure, cursed maps, and powerful spirits that guard places that humanity was never meant to enter. So yeah, not exactly fun little sunset hike with family energy, but to each their own. Some visitors have described even stranger encounters deeper within the range, including the sighting of figures watching them from cliffs, animals that appear and vanish without tracks, sudden cold pockets in brutal heat, and winds that seem to rush upwards from the cracks within the earth. And in a few stories, people hear someone whistling from the rocks after dark, always just far enough away to make them wonder if another hiker is lost nearby. The sound moves when they move, stops when they stop, and if they whistle back, which I know I just got done telling you not to do, this whistle answers from a different direction. And I don't know what the official hiking guide says about that, but my personal policy would be pretty simple. As before, never whistle back at anything that whistles at you after dark. Do not investigate the canyon noise, and do not let Arizona's cursed treasure mountain talk you into becoming its next fun little bullet point in history. Our fourth haunt drags us to the far southwestern corner of Arizona and has us stepping through the iron gates of the infamous Yuma Territorial Prison. Continuing this adventure, Yuma Territorial Prison, which is placed in Yuma County overlooking the Colorado River in Arizona, is one of the most iconic and feared historic sites in the American Southwest. A stone-walled frontier prison built into a granite bluff where thousands of convicts once lived behind iron bars, baked beneath the brutal desert heat, and learned very quickly that the Arizona Territory was not exactly messing around with law and order. Today, it operates as a state historic park and museum, where visitors can walk through the old Sally Port, explore the cell blocks, enter the punishment chamber known as the Dark Cell, and look out toward the prison cemetery, where more than 100 inmates who never made it home remain buried beneath the desert earth. But within the preserved walls, displays, and tourist photos, Yuma Territorial Prison is also widely considered one of the most haunted places in Arizona, with reports of angry phantom voices, cold hands, ghostly inmates, shadowy figures, and one little girl in red who apparently has absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. Historically, the prison's story begins with Yuma itself, which had been important long before the first cell was ever carved into the hill. Native peoples, including ancestors of the modern Quechan and Cocopah, lived around the Colorado River crossing for centuries past, and later Spanish expeditions, military routes, ferries, gold rush traffic, stage roads, steamboats, and even U.S. Army supply lines all turned Yuma into one of the most important gateways to the Southwest in existence. By the 1870s, the town had already changed names several times, survived several floods, had become a major crossing point into California, and had gained the kind of wild frontier reputation where having a real territorial prison nearby started to seem less like a luxury and more like basic survival. In 1875, the Arizona Territorial Legislature authorized the prison and set aside $25,000 for its construction, and by early 1876, work had started on the granite hill above the river. The first 7 inmates entered on July 1st of 1876, and in one of those wonderfully brutal Old West details, those prisoners were immediately put to work chiseling out the first cells of the very prison that was now holding them. Imagine being sentenced to prison and then being told, great news, you also get to help, build it. Over the next 33 years, Yuma Territorial Prison would hold 3,069 men and women convicted of everything from murder and robbery to grand larceny, stagecoach theft, polygamy, adultery, and other crimes that sounded like they were written down by someone wearing a dusty hat at the Salem witch trials or something. Despite its vicious nickname as the Hellhole, the prison was also weirdly progressive for its time. By the 1880s and 90s, it had electricity, sanitation, forced ventilation, a prison band, a hospital, schooling, and one of the first public libraries in the Arizona Territory, which made local residents joke bitterly that the inmates were living in the country club on the Colorado. And listen, I kind of understand the jealousy when the prisoners have amenities the town doesn't, but also they were still locked inside of tiny stone cells in Yuma, Arizona, so maybe let's not get too carried away with the luxury branding. Anywho, the prison also held 29 female inmates during its operation, including Pearl Hart, the so-called Bandit Queen, who became nationally famous after she and Joe Boot robbed the Globe de Florence stagecoach in 1899. But the prison's more humane features didn't erase the suffering behind its walls. In 1887, the Gates riot left 4 prisoners dead and the superintendent wounded after inmates took him hostage and demanded the gates be opened. In 1894, officials carved the infamous dark cell into the granite hillside, a pitch-black punishment chamber for prisoners who broke the rules. And inside, inmates could be stripped down, fed bread and water only, and confined in darkness, with a cage so low that taller men couldn't fully stand upright. Across the prison's full lifespan, 111 prisoners died while incarcerated, and only 104 of them were buried in the cemetery below. In 1909, overcrowding finally forced the prison to close, and the remaining inmates were transferred to the newer facility in Florence. And afterward, the old prison became Yuma High School from 1910 to 1914, and was partly damaged by later railroad work, before sheltering desperate families and transients during the town's harder years. Eventually, in 1941, it was listed as a city museum, and was established as one of Arizona's earliest state parks by 1961. In the present, the surviving cell blocks, Sallyport, Guard Tower, Dark Cell, Cemetery, and museum exhibits still stand, which is great for history, but probably less great if any of the former residents decided they weren't quite finished serving their time. Chillingly, the Dark Cell is considered the most haunted area of the prison, and honestly, it would be kind of weird if it wasn't. Visitors who step inside the Dark Cell have reported sudden pressure, heavy sadness, dizziness, nausea, cold spots, unseen hands touching them, and the overwhelming feeling that someone else is standing right beside them in the darkness. Some claim they've heard breathing or whispers close to their ears or on the backs of their necks, while others have heard angry voices tell or even yell at them, "Get out!" The chamber is already kind of deeply unsettling before you add the ghost stories, because once you stand inside a pitch-black stone punishment room where people were literally chained, starved down to bread and water, and left with the heat, insects, scorpions, and their own thoughts, you do start to understand why anything trapped in there emotionally may come out a little, not so customer-friendly. The prison's most famous ghost, however, is not some hardened outlaw or angry murderer, but a little girl in a red dress. According to local legend, this child drowned in the nearby Colorado River while trying to retrieve her doll or a toy, and now she haunts the prison grounds, especially when visitors wearing red are around. She's said to pinch people, poke them, tug at their clothing, brush cold fingers across their skin, and has occasionally even made herself known around children, which, first of all, terrifying, second of all, deeply rude, and third of all, imagine walking into one of the most famously haunted prisons in America as a child, mentally prepared for dead criminals, violent inmates, and cursed solitary confinement, and the thing that pops out at you is some grudge, The Ring status ghost toddler with a color preference and a pinching problem. Other spirits are said to linger inside the old cell block, and visitors have reported shadowy figures behind bars, footsteps moving through empty corridors, the sounds of chains dragging across stone, and faces appearing within cells that should be completely empty. Another popular legend centers on Cell 14, which is often tied to an inmate named John Ryan, who is said to have died by suicide there in the early 1900s. Now, those who passed the cell have reported sudden icy chills, the feeling of being stared down by something hostile, and a heavy oppressive energy that seems to gather near the bars. While other accounts describe the sounds of screaming, pleading, or of distant prison band music echoing through the grounds after hours. Because apparently, even in death, some of us still need to practice. The cemetery below the prison adds another layer to the activity. Of the 111 inmates who died during the prison's years of operation, as mentioned, only 104 were buried, many beneath simple stone markers or numbered graves. Both visitors and paranormal investigators here have reported uneasy sensations near the burial ground, shadowy figures between the stones, and the feeling that the dead are still somehow moving between the cemetery and the prison walls above. Reports also mention the ghost of a woman in white sighted standing near the banks of the Colorado River, possibly the aforementioned little girl's mother searching for her drowned daughter, and some tie these stories directly back to the legend of the girl in red, which also kind of makes the whole thing infinitely sadder. Inside the museum and visitor areas, staff and guests have reported objects moving on their own, coins that shift or disappear from registers, lights flickering, unexplained noises from empty rooms, and singing heard when no one else is present. And some visitors claim photographs taken inside the prison later show figures, faces, or strange shapes that they didn't notice while taking the photo in the first place. While others describe the feeling of being followed from cell to cell as if something is walking just a few steps behind them but stops every time they turn around. Oh, and down near the dark cell, where the air turns heavy, the light drops away, and the old stones seem to hold every scream they ever absorbed, people still report touches against their arms, whispers from behind, and the sudden sharp pinch of tiny fingers warning that maybe, just maybe, they picked the wrong color to wear that day. Our fifth and final haunt lands us in the heart of downtown Tucson, and has us checking into the legendary Hotel Congress. Closing out this adventure, Hotel Congress, which is placed along East Congress Street in Tucson, Arizona, is a historic red brick hotel, bar, restaurant, music venue, and all-around downtown landmark that's been sitting across from the old Southern Pacific Rail corridor for over a century. Today, it's known for Club Congress, the Cup Cafe, Tiger's Tap Room, its giant neon sign, its Dillinger history, and its ridiculously strong ability to make you feel like you've stepped into about 4 different decades at the same time. But behind all the cocktails, concerts, tiled floors, old switchboards, and vintage desert charm, Hotel Congress is also believed by many to be one of the most haunted buildings in Arizona, if not the US. With ghost stories attached to its rooms, staircases, hallways, lobby, and even their antique doors that refuse to stay locked. Historically, the story of Hotel Congress starts with Tucson's growth as a rail-connected desert city. The Southern Pacific Railroad reached Tucson in 1880, and by the early 1900s, the area around Congress Street had become one of the city's busiest commercial districts, especially after the Southern Pacific Depot was built nearby in 1907. Furthering this claim to popularity, Arizona would become a state in 1912, and Congress Street was paved just a year later in 1913. So by the time Hotel Congress was fully constructed in 1919, Tucson was no longer just some dusty frontier stop trying to figure out what it wanted to be when it grew up. It was a real city, with travelers stepping off of trains, downtown businesses filling in around them, and apparently enough demand for a stylish hotel that someone finally said, you know what this desert railroad district needs? Guest rooms, a cafe, a barber, a beauty shop, oh, and plenty of booze. The hotel itself was designed by William Curlett and Son Architects and originally rose 3 stories above Congress Street, with its rooms upstairs and commercial spaces filling in down below. Its famous tap room also traces back to this early era, though Arizona had already gone dry in 1915, because apparently Prohibition in Arizona decided to arrive early and ruin everyone's fun before the rest of the country even got fully committed to it. After the national repeal in 1933, the tap room officially roared back to life, though let's be honest, it was probably sneaking around the whole time. And over the years, Hotel Congress became a social anchor for downtown Tucson, hosting travelers, locals, artists, businessmen, gangsters, musicians, late-night drinkers, questionable decisions, and eventually enough stories to make the building feel less like a hotel and more like a living archive with a liquor license. But Hotel Congress would become nationally famous because of one very specific incident. On January 21st of 1934, Public Enemy Number 1 gangster John Dillinger and 3 members of his gang, Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark, arrived in Tucson while trying to lay low from the law. The gang had rented a house on North 2nd Avenue, but according to local history, the floors in this house had just been waxed, so some, if not all of them, spent the night at Hotel Congress instead, which is one of those tiny practical decisions that somehow ends up changing American crime history forever. On the morning of January 23rd, a fire broke out at the hotel, burning through the building and forcing firefighters to rescue guests from its upper floors. 2 of those guests were gang members staying under fake names, and when firemen helped them retrieve their unusually heavy luggage, they became suspicious. That suspicion turned out to be extremely valid, as after comparing the men to photos in True Detective Mysteries magazine, Tucson firefighters alerted police, and on January 25th in 1934, Dillinger and the gang were captured across the city without a single shot fired. Inside their luggage and hideouts, officers found countless weapons, bulletproof vests, cash, and enough gangster equipment to make the whole waxed floor excuse feel more like a lucky break. The fire destroyed the hotel's 3rd floor, which was never rebuilt, reducing the building from its originally taller form to the 2-story landmark we see today. Later, the hotel continued shifting with Tucson itself. Murals by Larry Boyce were painted through the late 1980s. Club Congress opened in 1985. The Cup Cafe opened in 1990. Annual Dillinger Days began in the 1990s as well. And in 2003, Hotel Congress was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Chillingly, with more than 100 years of guests, musicians, bartenders, outlaws, fires, long-term residents, and late-night weirdness soaked into its walls, Hotel Congress has collected a pretty impressive lineup of ghost stories, and the building itself doesn't seem all that shy about introducing them to guests. One of its best-known spirits is the Victorian gentleman of room 214, a sharply dressed man usually described in a seersucker suit and sometimes a top hat, who is said to wander the halls or stand at the room's window watching the plaza below. Guests have also reported sighting him from outside of the building, only to later learn the room was empty at the time, which honestly is kind of exactly the type of old-timey ghost behavior you'd expect from a guy stuck in a top hat forever. No screaming, crawling across the ceilings, just quietly judging everyone with his nose up from a 2nd-story window like the afterlife's most committed hotel critic. Room 212 is tied to the locksmith's apprentice, a mischievous presence known for doors that refuse to behave, and guests staying in this room have reported locking the door, settling in for the night, and then discovering it open again, over and over again, as if something invisible is waiting for them to fall asleep and then picking the lock just to be annoying. In some accounts, the door opens repeatedly until the guests give up and leave it open, only for it to begin closing again. And I know that doesn't sound as dramatic as a flaming demon materializing in the hallway, but I promise, if you're alone in a historic hotel room at 2 in the morning and the door starts playing games with you, you're not just calmly appreciating the craftsmanship of the latch. Room 220 is said to belong to a ghostly World War II veteran who arrived at Hotel Congress in 1965 and never really left. According to the hotel's own story, he followed the same routine every day, heading downstairs for coffee, a small plate, a bagel, and a butter knife, and then he'd return upstairs to eat before leaving the cup and plate outside of his room. The butter knife never came back, however, because he was known as a self-styled handyman who actually used them to fix things around the building. After his death in 2001, housekeepers and guests began finding restaurant butter knives outside the rooms at random, as well as across the property, while others reported objects being moved, doors locking or unlocking on their own, and the sense that the old handyman was still making his rounds. Which is honestly both creepy and kind of practical. Some ghosts throw plates. This guy apparently fixes things. So, thanks? Hotel Congress is also home to several female spirits, including the lace-shrouded Lady of the Staircase who is said to drift through the lobby while carrying the faint scent of roses, and another woman has reportedly appeared as a helpful desk clerk, with one guest allegedly asking later about the woman who had assisted them, only for staff to explain that no woman had been scheduled working the desk that night. There are also stories of a maid who is always cleaning, shadowy figures moving through the hallways, footsteps heard crossing through empty rooms, strange noises from areas with no guests, and figures or faces appearing in photographs after the picture is taken. So not only does Hotel Congress have ghosts, it has a whole supernatural staff schedule, which feels very on brand for a place that refuses to stop operating even in death. But the darkest room in the hotel's ghost lore is easily room 242, which is often associated with the hotel's woman in white. According to the hotel's version, a young woman was staying in this room for an extended period while going through an increasingly troubled time in her life, and told a number of people that she just wanted to make the voices stop. Now, staff and guests grew concerned and authorities were called, but before anyone could save her, she took her own life. Her spirit is now said to remain inside the room where she died, and guests there have reported a heavy, oppressive feeling the moment they step in, as if the air itself has somehow thickened. Some wait to find a woman in a long white dress sitting on the edge of the bed watching them sleep, while others feel someone lying beside them beneath the covers, only to turn over and find the mattress empty. And for those who want an extra dose of absolutely not sleeping tonight, other versions entirely of Room 242's story get even darker, tying the woman to a gunshot death, a standoff with authorities, or a violent emotional spiral or affair that ended inside the room. Regardless of the version, the activity remains pointedly personal, and many guests describe whispering near their bed, cold pressure against their bodies, bathroom manifestations, unexplained noises, and the feeling that the woman is not merely passing through, but waiting directly inside the space where she died. Some claim she appears lonely, others that the room feels angry, and a few even that suggest the longer they stay, the more they feel as if something is trying to share whatever darkness drove it there in the first place. Starting with a weight on the mattress, a shape out of the peripheral, and the sensation that someone breathing softly is watching beside them in the dark. Thanks for joining me on this journey through some of Arizona's most haunted places. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share it with all of your friends. I'll see you all next time, and pleasant dreams.